welcome. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Or, I might show up at your door. I'm just here to share some creepy stories, so sit back and enjoy. Disclaimer: the content presented in the video is purely for entertainment purposes only. The theories and stories discussed in this video are speculative and are not supported by any evidence or proof. Viewer discretion is advised. The evening had settled into the kind of quiet only a suburban neighborhood could offer. The sort of quiet that's almost comforting. An easy hum of distant cars, the occasional bark of a dog, and the soft rustle of leaves as the wind slides through the trees. My apartment was just one of many nestled between cookie-cutter houses, all identical except for the faint differences in the lawn decorations or the color of the front door. Nothing ever happened here. No one ever really noticed. Or at least that's what I had convinced myself of. I just finished dinner, a microwave meal I had thrown together in the minutes before the microwave timer buzzed in a triumphant symphony of modern laziness. I'd been meaning to go out for groceries, but the lethargy of the evening had taken over. The week had been long. It had been a slow burn, like dragging yourself through mud, one foot after the other. I sat back in my couch, the soft glow of my phone lighting up the room, a strange contrast to the deepening dusk outside. Scrolling through my usual mix of texts, social media, and the various apps that often rotted my brain in quiet solitude, I saw a banner flash across my screen. An emergency alert. It wasn't unusual. Those things pinged all the time: flood warnings, fire evacuations, weather updates. But this one was different. The usual urgent red banner had a cryptic message: emergency alert. Do not speak. I stared at it, blinking. Did I misread that? No, it was clear as day. Do not speak. A small, uneasy laugh bubbled up in my throat, though it felt more nervous than amused. This had to be some kind of glitch, right? Some technical hiccup in the alert system. People made jokes all the time about the ridiculousness of random emergency alerts. My mind drifted to those absurd notifications about zombies or extraterrestrial invasions that turned out to be nothing more than a rogue software update. I set my phone down, rolling my eyes at the absurdity of it all. But the more I thought about it, the more it didn't sit right. The message was too specific. It wasn't just saying, stay indoors or take shelter. No, it said don't speak, like a command. My pulse quickened, and I reached for the remote to turn on the TV, hoping to hear some news coverage or explanation for the bizarre message. The screen flickered as I switched channels. Every station had the same message: emergency alert, do not speak. It flashed in bold red across the bottom of the screen. Some channels were running a looping warning. Others were showing live footage of people standing in silence, visibly unnerved by the odd instruction. One anchor sat, staring at the camera with an expression so rigid that I couldn't tell if he was afraid or just waiting for the transmission to stop. I scanned the faces of the people on screen, those caught in the grip of this strange alert. Some looked confused, others frightened, and a few appeared resigned, like they knew something I didn't. But there was no explanation, no reason why this bizarre command had been issued. I tried to call a few friends. I had to know if they had received the alert too. Maybe it was just a local thing, some kind of isolated mistake. No one picked up. They'd all been on their phones earlier. I shot off a quick text instead. Did you get the emergency alert? I paused before adding, what's going on? Nothing. Not even a notification that they had seen the message. The texts remained unread. I shot a glance around the room, then at my phone. I hesitated for a moment, considering what to do next. What if this was some sort of test? Some viral hoax? I was getting paranoid. It was just an alert, just a mistake. Still, the unease gnawed at me. I had a friend who worked in emergency services, so I decided to call him. Maybe he had more information. The phone rang several times, but when the voicemail picked up, I felt that uneasy tension crack down my spine. What the hell was going on? The silence in my apartment seemed oppressive now, too thick. I stood up, pacing, my mind racing through different scenarios. What if it wasn't a glitch? What if it was something more? I moved to the kitchen, trying to shake the weird feeling settling in my chest. As I poured a glass of water, the phone buzzed again. This time, it was a group text from a friend of mine. "Did you guys get that alert?" she wrote, followed by, "What the hell does it mean?" A sense of relief washed over me. At least I wasn't alone in this weirdness. But even as I typed out my response, I felt my throat tighten. I had no idea what was happening, but I couldn't shake the nagging thought that something was off. I heard a noise outside. The quiet hum of traffic had ceased for a moment, leaving an eerie stillness in the air. My apartment complex was usually alive with sounds. Dogs barking, kids playing in the yard, people having conversations. But now, nothing. I glanced out the window to see people standing on their porches or leaning out of their windows, looking down the street with a kind of blank intensity. No one was talking. Not a single voice broke the oppressive silence. It was almost as if the world had been muted. I turned off the TV, feeling an unsettling tension settle deep in my bones. The lack of answers was suffocating. As I stared at my phone, a new alert came through, echoing the same cryptic message. I jumped slightly at the sound of my phone buzzing again. Another alert. The words on the screen were the same: "Do not speak." And below it, "If you do, they will hear you." I froze. The text echoed in my mind, like a whisper just out of reach. The fear was creeping in now. My hand trembled as I set the phone down on the table. Suddenly, I wasn't sure what to do next. Should I follow this weird command? What if speaking really did bring something? Was that even possible? I looked at my reflection in the dark window, the only sound my own shallow breathing. The world outside was still silent, and it was starting to feel like that silence was about to swallow me whole. The next morning came without the usual bustle of life outside my window. The day seemed to have slunk in unnoticed, like a shadow creeping under a door. I had slept poorly, my mind circling around the eerie instructions from the night before. I kept waking up, half expecting someone, or something, to be in my room, waiting for me to speak. Every time I tried to drift off again, my thoughts would scream to me, "Don't speak, don't speak." I stood up, stretched, and stared out the window. The world seemed quieter than it should have been. The houses across the street, normally full of people going about their business, sat in a strange, oppressive stillness. There were no lawnmowers buzzing, no sounds of children playing or dogs barking, just the wind whispering through the trees, a sound that felt too fragile, too easily disturbed. I grabbed my phone, the first instinct of the day. The same warning was there, like a bad dream repeating itself. "Emergency alert. Do not speak." I shook my head, wondering how far this strange thing had spread. I swiped through my contacts, seeing that no one had replied to my messages from last night. It was starting to feel like everyone had gone mute. I wondered if I was the only one who hadn't complied with the instructions, as though staying silent was some kind of social norm now. There was a sudden, sharp knock at the door, the sound making my heart jump. I approached cautiously, hesitating. Should I open it? What if someone had come to give me more bad news? Or worse, what if they were waiting for me to speak? I felt ridiculous, but it was too late to turn back now. I opened the door only to find nobody there. No one at all. But something had been left on the doorstep. A small slip of paper, its edges frayed as if it had been tossed there in a hurry. The handwriting was messy, hurried, and the message was just as unnerving as the one on my phone. "Don't speak. If you do, they'll hear you." The same warning, same strange command. But this felt different. The air around me seemed to thicken, as if the very atmosphere had grown heavier, more suffocating. I bent down to pick up the paper, scanning the empty street. Even the usual hum of life had been swallowed by the silence. The chill in the air seemed unnatural, like the earth itself was holding its breath. I closed the door behind me and walked back into the living room, still holding the paper. My thoughts were spiraling. Who was sending these messages? Were they the same person responsible for the alert? Was this some kind of coordinated event? Or was it something worse? I had no answers, only this growing, gnawing sensation that something was terribly wrong. I stood by the window, watching as a couple of my neighbors ventured out onto their front porches. They didn't speak. They didn't wave or greet each other as they normally would. They just stood there, eyes wide, looking across the street, scanning their surroundings. Their bodies were tense, as though they were all silently waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The silence was suffocating. Then I noticed something strange. The man across the street, the one who lived in the house with the green shutters, seemed to be staring at something. No, not at something, into something. His eyes were fixed on an empty spot in the street, unmoving, unblinking. He didn't look away, even when his wife came outside and stood beside him. She glanced over at him, then at the space he was staring at, but she didn't speak. No words came from either of them. I swallowed. It felt like I was witnessing something unnatural, something deeply unsettling. I couldn't pull my eyes away, even though I knew I should. I needed to know what was happening, but every fiber of my being screamed at me to stay silent. I glanced back at my phone. No new messages, but it was getting harder to ignore the feeling that something was lurking in the silence, waiting for me to break it. After a few minutes, the neighbors retreated back inside their homes, like the whole street was under some unspoken agreement to remain still. I waited for the sound of cars driving by or the distant chatter of other neighbors, but it never came. Everything was eerily quiet. Too quiet. I needed to get out of here. I had to see if the rest of the world was like this. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe I was the only one who felt like something was wrong. I grabbed my jacket, slipped on my shoes, and left my apartment. The street outside felt even quieter than it had the night before. I walked briskly, trying to shake off the feeling of unease that seemed to cling to every inch of the air. The silence was so deep that my footsteps sounded like they were being swallowed by the asphalt itself. I could hear my own breathing, ragged and shallow, and I hated it. As I walked, I passed the homes of my neighbors. Their windows were dark, curtains drawn tight. There was no sign of life in any of them. Even the streetlights, which normally flickered to life at dusk, remained dead and cold. No hum of power, no vibrations in the air, nothing. I reached the corner of my block, where I'd usually hear the sound of cars cruising down the road, people rushing off to work or home. But there was nothing, not a single car. The whole world felt like it had frozen. I stepped onto the sidewalk, glancing around nervously, and that's when I saw it. A woman stood at the far end of the block, motionless. Her hands were clasped tightly together in front of her, and she was staring directly at me. Her face was pale, her eyes wide, as though she was waiting for something to happen, waiting for me to speak. My heart raced in my chest. I swallowed, forcing my throat to stay dry. The air felt thick with tension, and the woman didn't blink. She just stared. I tried to speak, just a simple greeting to ask if she was okay. But the words didn't come. I couldn't do it. I couldn't break the silence. Something in my gut told me not to. And as I stood there, facing the woman who didn't move, I realized I wasn't sure if I was afraid of speaking, or if I was more afraid of what would happen if I didn't. I couldn't bring myself to move. The woman stood at the end of the block, her pale face fixed on me like some kind of haunting vision. I don't know how long we stood there, just staring at each other. My mind screamed at me to turn around, to go back inside, but my body didn't obey. I couldn't tear my eyes away from her. The silence between us stretched so thick it felt suffocating, like the very air was pressing down on me. The weight of it was unbearable, and still the woman didn't blink. Her eyes were wide open, staring directly into mine with an intensity that seemed to pierce right through me. It was as if she was waiting for something, waiting for me to speak. I clenched my fists at my sides, willing myself to do something, anything, but no sound came from my mouth. My throat felt dry, tight, as though it had been wrapped in a vice. Every part of me screamed to say something, to break the silence, but I couldn't. And somehow I didn't want to. A distant voice echoed in the back of my mind, the words from the alert flashing through my head. Do not speak. It wasn't just some glitch or mistake. The warning was real and it was meant to be followed. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that something terrible could happen if I did break the silence. But what? What would happen? My heart was pounding in my chest now, a heavy thud that reverberated through my entire body. I could feel my palms beginning to sweat, my breath shallow and quick. The woman didn't move. She didn't speak. She just continued to stand there, her gaze fixed on me. I glanced down the street, looking for any sign of life, but the street remained eerily still. There were no cars, no people walking, no dogs barking. Nothing. Just an unnatural stillness that seemed to hold the entire world in place. And it wasn't just here, it was everywhere. The entire neighborhood had fallen silent. The world outside had been muted, swallowed whole by the silence. I took a slow, deliberate step backward, my eyes never leaving the woman. I didn't want to look away, didn't want to break the gaze. But I couldn't stand there forever. I had to do something. I had to get away from her. My legs felt heavy as I slowly turned around, my movements slow and deliberate. But as I took another step, I heard it, the faintest sound, barely a whisper, but it cut through the silence like a blade. A soft hiss. I froze. It came again, louder this time, like a breath being exhaled too forcefully. I spun around, heart racing, but the woman was still there, unmoving, her eyes locked onto me. The sound seemed to be coming from all around me now, swirling in the air, as if the very atmosphere itself was alive, suffocating me with its presence. Another hiss. This time I felt it. The air around me seemed to vibrate, like the very ground beneath my feet was trembling. My breath caught in my throat, and for the first time since I'd left my apartment, I felt a primal, bone-deep fear. The kind of fear that makes your body freeze, that makes you feel like prey in the presence of a predator. I looked around, desperate to understand what was happening, but there was nothing. No sign of anything unusual. No reason for the growing panic in my chest. But that sound, that terrible hiss, it was coming from everywhere. The trees, the sky, the buildings. It was inside my head. I wanted to scream, to run, but the weight of the silence kept me rooted to the spot. The woman was still staring, her expression unchanging, her eyes wide with something. Couldn't read it. Fear? Curiosity? But as I stood there, trapped in the unblinking gaze of the woman, the ground beneath me seemed to tremble again. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but then it grew stronger, like the earth itself was alive. The hissing intensified, echoing in my ears, and I realized that the source of it wasn't just the air around me. It was coming from beneath me. The woman's eyes flickered, just for a moment, but it was enough. Caught it, the briefest hint of something other. The look on her face twisted, just slightly, into something that almost resembled a grin. But it wasn't a grin of reassurance. It wasn't the kind of smile you make when you're glad to see someone. No, it was something darker. My stomach twisted. I had to get away. I couldn't stay here any longer. My feet felt like they were glued to the ground, but I forced myself to turn, forced myself to take a step back toward my apartment. The sound grew louder. The hiss became more pronounced, as if something or someone was slithering toward me. I glanced over my shoulder once, then twice, but the woman hadn't moved. She was still standing there, her eyes never leaving mine. I broke into a run. My footsteps were loud now, thudding against the pavement, and I could feel the vibrations of the ground beneath me with every stride. The hiss was getting closer, the sound filling my ears, growing louder and more desperate. Something was chasing me. I didn't look back. I couldn't afford to. The air around me was thick with the presence of whatever it was that followed me, but every part of me told me that I couldn't stop running. I reached the stairs of my building, stumbling as I raced up to my door. I fumbled with my keys, heart pounding in my chest, and slammed the door behind me as soon as I was inside. I leaned against it, panting, hands shaking. Silence. It was gone. The sound, the presence, the woman. But as I stood there, gasping for air, I realized something. The silence outside was different now. The world felt off, like something had changed, something permanent, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to understand what it was. I needed answers. I needed to know what was happening. But as the minutes stretched on, I felt a gnawing fear in my gut. What if I already knew? I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, even though I was back inside my apartment. My eyes darted to every corner of the room, searching for some sign, some clue, but everything remained as it had been. No sudden movements, no figures lurking in the shadows, just the same empty space. But the silence was worse. It felt as though it had taken on a life of its own, lingering in the air, pressing against my chest, suffocating me slowly. I locked the door, not because I believed it would keep anything out, but because I needed something to hold on to. A sense of control, however false it might be. My hands were still shaking from the run, and my mind kept replaying the woman's eyes, the hiss that seemed to come from the very earth beneath my feet, the sickening feeling that something was closing in. I forced myself to sit down, to take a deep breath and steady my thoughts. What had just happened? Was it some kind of mass panic? Some weird collective hallucination that everyone was experiencing? It seemed impossible, felt like more than that. Something was coming, something unnatural. I pulled my phone from my pocket, almost afraid to check it, but the need to know, to understand, overwhelmed me. The screen flickered for a moment before the same emergency alert flashed across it. Its message still as chilling as ever. Do not speak. I scanned the rest of my messages. Nothing. Everyone in my contacts had gone silent. Not a single person had reached out. Not even a simple, "Are you okay?" or "What's going on?" It was as if they had all just disappeared. Or worse, as if they had become mute. And the more I thought about it, the more unsettling the idea became. What if everyone was obeying the warning? What if speaking was some kind of trigger? What if it was too dangerous to even utter a single word? I shook my head, trying to rid myself of the thoughts that were creeping in. They didn't make sense. They couldn't. But something in the back of my mind whispered that they were true. I grabbed a glass of water from the counter, trying to ground myself in something normal, something that could offer comfort. But when I took a sip, the water tasted off. There was a strange, metallic aftertaste that lingered on my tongue, something I couldn't place. I put the glass down, suddenly feeling a wave of nausea roll over me. No, couldn't let my mind run wild. I had to stay calm, but that was the problem, wasn't it? The longer I stayed silent, the more the silence seemed to press in, the more it felt like I was being suffocated by it. And now, with that strange aftertaste in my mouth, I couldn't help but wonder if the silence was poisoning me. I glanced back at my phone, and for the first time since I checked it earlier, I noticed something new. The messages on my screen had changed just slightly. There were no new notifications, but the emergency alert had taken on a different tone. It no longer just said, "Do not speak." Instead, there were additional words, hidden beneath the original message, barely visible, like an afterthought. "The silence is waiting. Do not resist." My blood ran cold. The silence is waiting. What did that even mean? And why did it feel so ominous? Why did it seem like I was being watched as I read those words? As if the screen was somehow absorbing the thoughts in my head, feeding off my fear. I pulled myself away from the phone, trying to shake off the creeping dread that had settled over me. I couldn't let myself get lost in it, but every part of me was on edge, like a wire stretched too tight, just waiting to snap. The silence outside, the silence inside. It felt like something was building, like a storm on the horizon, but one that didn't need thunder or lightning to tear everything apart. I stood up and paced the room. I needed to do something, anything, to break the tension. My eyes darted to the window, but I didn't dare look outside again. The woman, the one I had seen standing across the street, still staring at me with those unblinking eyes. What had happened to her? Where had she gone? Was she still out there? Was she waiting for me to speak? Or worse, was she waiting for me to stay silent? The thought made my skin crawl. But I had no answers, just more questions piling up, a never-ending stack of uncertainty that threatened to crush me. I shook my head, trying to clear it. I had to think logically. I needed to understand what was happening, to piece together whatever fragments of information I had. Then it hit me, the hiss, the sound I'd heard as I'd run back to my apartment. It hadn't been just a random noise, something happening by chance. No, it had been a warning, a signal. And the worst part? It had seemed like it was coming from beneath the ground, like something was moving under the earth itself, something alive, something ancient. The woman had known that. She had been staring at me because she had heard it too. She had felt it, and she hadn't spoken either. She hadn't dared to, but why? I stopped pacing. My mind flashed back to the alert message. It had warned against speaking, yes, but it also said something else. If you resist, you will be found. I froze. What if this wasn't about silence at all? What if it was about something more insidious? What if the silence was the trap? I felt like I was standing on the edge of something, just one step away from understanding. But what if I didn't want to understand? The lights flickered overhead briefly, as though the power was trying to go out. I took a step back, instinctively reaching for my phone again, but then I stopped. No, I had to stop reacting. I had to stop letting the fear control me. The fear wasn't the real enemy. It was whatever lay beneath the surface, the thing that had started this whole mess. I didn't have the answers, but I had to find them. The night passed in a strange, dreamlike haze, and I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, the silence would close in around me, smothering my thoughts, making it harder to breathe. I could still hear that hiss in my mind, reverberating through the walls of my apartment, curling around me like a predator stalking its prey. I knew I couldn't afford to fall asleep. I had to stay awake, stay aware, because I had no idea what was happening, and every second that passed, I felt like I was losing control of the situation. When the morning came, the sunlight was a pale, sickly color, filtering through the blinds in weak, trembling beams. It didn't feel like the light was meant to shine. It felt like it was simply there, as if the world had forgotten its purpose. I sat up, my body stiff and aching from the night spent tossing and turning, and immediately felt the weight of the silence pressing in again. It was worse in the daylight. The world was supposed to be moving, but everything was static, frozen in place. The streets were empty, the sky devoid of any clouds, the usual hum of traffic absent. The phone sat on the counter, its screen dark and empty. It had been hours since I last checked it, but I couldn't bring myself to look again. The silence it held was just as oppressive as the one outside. It felt like I was being suffocated, trapped in a world where no one could speak and no one would answer. No one was there to help, but I knew I couldn't just sit here, waiting for answers that would never come. I had to do something. I had to find out what was happening, and why it was happening, and what was waiting for me in the dark. I stood up, every muscle in my body protesting the movement. My legs felt like lead, as if the weight of the silence had seeped into my bones, making it harder to move, harder to think. But I pushed through it, grabbing my jacket off the back of the chair and walking toward the door. I wasn't sure where I was going. I didn't know what I expected to find out there, but I couldn't stay inside. I needed answers, and the only way I could get them was to face whatever was out there, whatever was waiting. I opened the door slowly, feeling the cool air rush past me, and stepped out into the hallway. The building was eerily quiet. It was like stepping into a forgotten place, a world where time had stopped. I could see the other apartments, their doors closed, their windows dark. It was as if everyone had simply vanished overnight. No sounds, no movement, nothing. Just the oppressive silence hanging over everything, suffocating it. I walked down the hallway, my footsteps muffled on the carpet. Each step felt like it was echoing in the stillness, like my presence was somehow wrong here. I reached the staircase and hesitated for a moment, glancing back at my door, then at the door to the stairwell. I had to keep moving forward. The answers I needed were out there, somewhere, and I couldn't keep hiding in this apartment forever. I descended the stairs, each step creaking under my weight, the only sound in the building. The air in the stairwell felt different, colder somehow, like it had been untouched for years. The walls were cracked and stained, the lights dim and flickering. It was as if the building itself had started to decay, but at a rate I couldn't quite place. It wasn't a gradual decline. It was like something had suddenly started to break down, as though the entire world was unraveling right before my eyes. When I reached the ground floor, I stood for a moment, taking in the silence of the lobby. There was no one else around. No one sitting in the waiting area, no one in the hallways. It was completely deserted. I could feel the weight of it again, like the stillness of the air was a physical thing, pressing on my chest, pushing me down. The lights flickered again, this time longer, casting strange shadows across the walls. I pulled open the door to the outside world and stepped out into the street. The moment I stepped outside, I felt it, that strange pressure, that feeling of being watched, of being followed. It was like the air was heavier here, like it was thick with something unseen, something watching from the edges of reality. I couldn't place it, but I could feel it, creeping along my spine, gnawing at the back of my mind. My breath caught in my throat, and I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being followed. I looked around. The street was as empty as it had been yesterday. No cars, no people, no sounds. The world felt hollow, like a stage with no actors, a scene waiting for something to happen. But what? I started walking, my footsteps dragging along the pavement. I couldn't stand still, couldn't just wait for whatever was coming. I had to keep moving, had to find out what was going on, and what had happened to everyone else. I reached the end of the block, my eyes scanning the horizon for anything unusual. That's when I saw it. The woman. She was standing at the same spot as before, at the far end of the street, her figure as still as a statue. Her eyes were locked onto me, just like the first time. But now there was something different about her. The silence around her seemed even more oppressive, like it was choking the life out of the world itself. I stopped in my tracks, my heart skipping a beat. The hissing sound from last night began again, softer this time, but still unmistakable. It was coming from all around me, wrapping itself around me like a cold, slithering thing. I couldn't move. The woman tilted her head ever so slightly, her eyes narrowing, her mouth twitching as if to speak. But she didn't. She couldn't. She didn't need to. The hiss grew louder, and in that moment, I realized that the silence was not just a force in the air. It was alive. It was waiting for me. I could feel it creeping under my skin, filling me up with an urge to run. But I couldn't. I had to stay. The woman took a step forward, and I instinctively stepped back, the terror in my gut rising like bile. She didn't speak. She didn't need to, and in that moment I understood. The silence wasn't just a warning. It was a curse. I had no idea how long I stood there, frozen in place, staring at the woman across the street. Time seemed to stretch and bend, the minutes slipping away like water through my fingers, as the silence smothered everything. Every inch of me screamed to move, to run, to break free from the suffocating weight pressing down on my chest. But I couldn't. My legs wouldn't cooperate, and my brain, that small voice inside me that used to be rational, seemed distant, like it was submerged underwater. The world had become a place where every instinct, every urge, was being suppressed by some invisible force. The woman took another step forward, her movements slow and deliberate, like she was approaching something, someone with a purpose. Her eyes never left me, and with each step, the air around us seemed to thicken, making it harder to breathe, harder to think. The hiss was louder now, filling my ears, wrapping around my thoughts until all I could hear was that disturbing, serpentine sound, coiling and curling in on itself. I could feel it, a shift in the atmosphere, a change that made the very air feel like it was made of needles, each one pressing into my skin. It wasn't just the silence anymore. It was the sensation of something wrong, as if everything I knew, everything I understood about the world, was being torn apart, thread by thread, and replaced by something alien, something far darker. And I couldn't look away from her. I didn't want to, but I couldn't stop myself. Her face remained expressionless, her lips slightly parted as if she were about to speak, but no sound ever came. She was a ghost, a memory frozen in time, yet there was something very real about her presence. Something that felt like it was waiting, just like the silence. And the longer I stared at her, the more I felt like she was studying me, like she was trying to understand what I was, what I had become in this twisted new world. Then, without warning, she stopped. For a moment, everything was still. The air seemed to hold its breath, and I couldn't move. I felt like I was caught in a trap, like my mind and body were at war, fighting for control. I wanted to turn around, to run, to escape this nightmare, but I couldn't. The silence kept me rooted in place, a prisoner to its weight. I couldn't even scream. There was no sound left in the world. Not even the simple act of breathing felt natural. Her head tilted slightly to one side, and she raised a hand, palm outward. It wasn't a gesture of greeting or communication. It was a command, a warning, and something inside me, deep within my gut, told me that I shouldn't obey it. But I did. The force of her presence was too much to ignore. She was the embodiment of the silence, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape her pull. I took a tentative step backward, but my feet felt heavy, as if they were sinking into the ground, as if the very earth was trying to hold me in place. The more I struggled, the more the world around me seemed to shrink, the air thickening until it felt like I was trapped in a suffocating vacuum. The hiss became a chorus, the sound multiplying and swirling, as if it were coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. And then I felt it, something beneath me. It wasn't just the ground anymore. It was something else, something shifting and moving, something alive. The sensation was primal, deep in my bones, and it sent a wave of terror crashing through me. My heart pounded in my chest, and my throat constricted, but I still couldn't speak, couldn't make a sound. The woman's eyes never left me as I stumbled back a few more steps, my legs weak and unsteady. And then, without warning, she moved again. Her pace was swift this time, unnatural, too fast, too smooth, as though she was gliding rather than walking. My pulse raced in my ears as she drew closer, her presence growing more oppressive with every inch she closed between us. I should have turned and run. I should have screamed for help, but I couldn't. Every instinct told me to stay still, to remain silent, to do nothing, as if the very act of defiance would lead to something worse. But despite the fear choking me, something else was beginning to stir, a cold clarity that I couldn't ignore. This wasn't just about silence. It wasn't just about avoiding the need to speak. This was something much deeper, something far more insidious. The silence wasn't the cause. It was the effect. The longer I stood there, the more it made sense. The curse wasn't just about preventing communication. It was about control. The silence was a tool, a weapon. It was as if something or someone was stripping away everything that made us human, piece by piece. The more we gave in, the more it took. And the more we resisted, the more it would come for us. It was a game and we were its prey. I turned my head to the side, unwilling to face the woman as she closed the distance between us. But I couldn't stop myself from seeing her out of the corner of my eye. Her face was still expressionless, her body moving with eerie precision. But there was something in her eyes now, something different. Her gaze had changed, no longer calculating or emotionless. There was something almost hungry in her stare. The hiss was now a full-on roar in my ears, and I felt like I was being suffocated by the sound itself. My head throbbed, and I pressed my hands to my ears in a futile attempt to block it out, but it didn't work. The sound was everywhere, inescapable. My legs buckled beneath me, and I fell to my knees, the pressure in my chest nearly unbearable. The woman reached out, and before I could stop her, her hand was on my shoulder. Her touch was ice cold, sending a shock of fear coursing through me. I wanted to pull away, to scream, to fight, but no words came. I couldn't even think. Her fingers tightened, and I felt the air around me go completely still. The hiss stopped, but only for a moment, and then, as if the world were waking up, I heard it, louder than before. Not just the hiss, but a sound more primal, more terrible. A voice. It wasn't human. It was a low, guttural growl, a noise that seemed to come from the earth itself, from deep beneath the surface. And as the sound grew louder, I realized something. The silence wasn't just something that was happening. It was something waiting to happen. The growl was deeper now, almost like it was coming from the very earth beneath my feet, vibrating through the ground and into my chest. It was a sound like nothing I had ever heard before, a noise so alien and primal that it made my skin crawl, a sharp contrast to the unnatural silence that had suffocated the world. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. It was as if every part of me had been frozen in place, every muscle, every thought, held hostage by the curse of silence. The woman's hand tightened on my shoulder, and I flinched, the coldness of her touch sending an icy shiver down my spine. It wasn't just the chill of her fingers that made me tremble. It was the realization that her presence wasn't just about her anymore. She was a vessel, a conduit for something far older, something far more powerful than I could ever comprehend. The silence, the hiss, the growl, it was all part of it. The curse wasn't just some supernatural force that sought to prevent speech. It was a manifestation of something that had been buried for centuries, maybe even longer. It was hungry, it was patient, and it had been waiting for a moment like this. I wanted to turn and run, but my body refused to obey. The weight of the silence had become so overwhelming that I could barely think, barely breathe. My head throbbed with a dull, rhythmic pulse, like a drumbeat that refused to stop. The silence had taken control of everything, and now it wanted something more. The growl deepened, shifting into something even more menacing, more deliberate. It was as though the very sound of it was tearing apart the fabric of reality itself, rending it from the inside out. I could feel it in my bones, the low rumble reverberating in my chest as if it were calling to something that existed far beyond the edges of human understanding. And then the first word. It wasn't like anything I had ever heard. It was not a sound formed by human lips or vocal cords. It was otherworldly, a deep, guttural vibration that echoed in my mind more than in my ears. The word wasn't spoken aloud. It was felt like a pulse, like a command that resonated through every part of my being. Listen, the word rang through my head, louder than any noise I had ever heard. The moment it hit me, I felt my throat tighten, my chest constrict, as if the very air around me had turned solid. My mind was screaming, but there was no sound. It was as if my thoughts themselves were being suffocated, drowned by the oppressive weight of that single word. I tried to pull away, but the woman's grip on my shoulder was unyielding. The pressure of her touch was like a vice, holding me in place, forcing me to listen, forcing me to experience the weight of the silence in its most terrifying form. My vision blurred, my mind foggy with the overwhelming sensation of something wrong that I couldn't escape, something ancient that was now alive, breathing, pressing against the world in ways I couldn't understand. Listen, the word echoed in my head again, and for a brief moment, I thought I heard something else. Another voice beneath the growl, a voice that was softer but no less terrifying. It was a voice filled with malice, a voice that was part of the very silence that surrounded us. They will never speak again. The woman's lips twitched, as if she were about to speak herself, but she remained silent. She didn't need to speak. Her presence, her touch, the growl beneath the earth, they were enough. Her eyes, dark and fathomless, stared into mine, and I could feel the weight of them, as if they were looking into my very soul, probing, searching, waiting for me to understand. The growl beneath us intensified, and the ground seemed to tremble slightly, a faint vibration that rattled my teeth and sent a wave of nausea through my stomach. I wanted to collapse, to give in to the overwhelming fear that clawed at my insides, but I couldn't. I couldn't move, and then I heard it again. The hiss. It wasn't just the single hiss from before. It was something more. A cacophony of hissing sounds, layered over one another. So many that it became impossible to tell where one ended and another began. The sound filled my head, louder now, more chaotic. It was as if the silence was being torn apart, as if the very air was splitting open, giving way to something darker, something more dangerous. The woman finally spoke. Her voice was a low murmur, like a whisper carried on the wind, but even in its softness, it was powerful. The words felt like they were coming from deep within her, as if they were being drawn from something inside her that was as old as the earth itself. It is too late. The words hung in the air, thick and heavy, like a sentence, like a final declaration. The ground beneath my feet shifted again, and I staggered, barely managing to keep my balance. The silence was now a living thing, crawling beneath my skin, tightening its grip on my throat, my lungs, my very thoughts. I could feel it suffocating me, pulling me deeper into its grasp. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But the words wouldn't come. The silence wouldn't allow it. It was everywhere, wrapping itself around me, locking me into place. You'll never escape, the woman's voice whispered again, softer this time. We'll all be silent. Forever. The coldness in her voice sent a shiver of terror down my spine. But it wasn't just fear that I felt. It was something else. A deep, gnawing emptiness. A void that threatened to swallow me whole. The silence was a force, an entity that had always been here, hiding just out of reach, waiting for the right moment to wake up. And now that moment had arrived. I tried to think, tried to force my mind to make sense of it all. But the weight of the silence was unbearable. The hiss, the growl, the voice, the woman. Everything was crashing into me. Each sound, each word. A force that left me powerless. I had to find a way to fight back. But how could I? How could anyone fight something so ancient, so all-encompassing, when silence was the only weapon it wielded? As the growl intensified and the woman's grip remained unyielding, I realized one terrifying truth. There was no escape. There was no hope. And soon, I would be just another lost soul in a world where the silence reigned supreme. The ground trembled beneath me, and the air grew thick with an unbearable pressure. It was as though the very fabric of reality was being stretched, distorted, and twisted beyond recognition. My lungs ached, my heart pounded in my chest, and yet, there was no sound. It wasn't just the silence anymore. It had become something else. It had become alive. A living, breathing entity that fed off the fear, the panic, the helplessness that I couldn't seem to escape. The woman's grip on my shoulder remained unyielding, and I could feel her cold, lifeless fingers digging into my skin. It was as if she were an anchor, keeping me tethered to this nightmare, pulling me deeper into its depths. Every instinct within me screamed to break free, to tear myself away from her and the suffocating silence, but my body wouldn't respond. My legs were frozen, my mind a swirling fog of fear and confusion, and the oppressive weight of the silence continued to press down on me. Her eyes were the only thing I could focus on. They were empty, hollow, like black voids that seemed to swallow everything in their gaze. There was no humanity in them, no compassion, no understanding. There was only hunger, a deep, insatiable hunger that was feeding off the fear and despair that now filled the air. And in that moment, I realized with chilling clarity that the woman wasn't just an agent of the silence. She was part of it. She was a vessel, a manifestation of something much darker and more ancient than I could ever comprehend. "It's not just the silence," she whispered, her voice like a snake's hiss, a low, guttural sound that crawled under my skin. "It's what comes after." I could feel the words reverberating in my bones, but I couldn't respond. My mouth was dry, my tongue heavy, and every attempt to speak was met with a crushing block of nothingness. The silence had taken my voice, and with it, my ability to fight back. I was nothing, a puppet bound by invisible strings, trapped in a nightmare I couldn't escape. The woman stepped closer, her eyes never leaving mine. Her lips barely moved as she spoke, but the words were clearer now, more distinct. "You think you're alone. You think this is just about silence, about being silenced. But it's more than that." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to sink in. I could feel the ground shifting beneath me again, as if something was stirring, something dark and primal, waking up from a long slumber. The hiss, the growl, the voices, they were all converging, building, expanding, wrapping themselves around me like a noose, tightening with every passing second. "The silence is only the beginning," she continued. "What comes after is far worse." I wanted to scream, to beg her to stop, to understand what she meant. But I couldn't. I couldn't speak, couldn't make a sound. And every moment that passed, the truth she was revealing became clearer, darker. There was something worse than silence. The growl beneath us had changed again. It was no longer just a sound, it was a presence, a force, a will pushing up from beneath the earth. The ground vibrated violently, sending shocks of panic through me, making my knees buckle. The air grew thick, suffocating, pressing in on me like the walls of a tomb. The woman's grip tightened, her fingers digging into my flesh, and I could feel a sharp, burning sensation spreading through my shoulder, as if her touch was seeping into me, merging with my very being. She wasn't just holding me, she was taking me. "The silence is a veil," she murmured, her voice soft but unmistakably chilling. "And once it falls away, what you'll see is something that was always there, something that has been waiting." Her words sent a ripple of dread through me. I could feel the air shifting around us, swirling in unnatural patterns, like something was moving beneath the surface, something vast and powerful. It was as if the very ground beneath me had become a living thing, a creature with a mind of its own, and it was pulling me closer to the edge of a void. "It's not just about preventing speech," she whispered, her voice growing colder. "It's about control, dominion over everything you thought you understood." The ground shook again, this time with such force that I nearly lost my balance. A crack appeared beneath my feet, and I stumbled backward, my feet sliding in the dirt as I tried desperately to stay upright. The hiss, the growl, the voices, they were all coming together now, a cacophony of sound and silence, mixing into something other, something that wasn't of this world. And then I heard it, a voice, clear, sharp, and unmistakable. It wasn't the growl or the hiss. It was human, or at least it sounded human. But the words it spoke were not words I recognized. They weren't even real words. They were a collection of syllables, a dissonant blend of sounds that didn't belong in any language. And yet, as they echoed in my mind, I understood them with horrifying clarity. "You are not the first." The voice was everywhere, in my head, in my ears, beneath my skin. It didn't come from anywhere, it was just there, like it had always been. And it wasn't just a voice, it was presence, power. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The air felt like it was thickening, turning to lead, weighing me down, suffocating me. The silence, the growl, the hissing, the voice, they were all merging, combining into something greater than they had ever been before. Something that was rising up, out of the depths, ready to consume everything in its path. And then it happened. The ground beneath me cracked open, and from the depths, something emerged. It wasn't a creature, not in the traditional sense. It didn't have form, not in any way I could understand. It was like an idea made real, a shadow, a wisp, a ripple in the fabric of existence itself. It was darkness, and that darkness stretched out, coiling, reaching for me, for all of us. The woman's eyes met mine, and for the first time, I saw something almost like pity in her gaze. But it wasn't pity for me. It was pity for what I would soon become. The first word echoed in my mind once more. Listen, and I understood. I understood everything. The world around me shifted as though reality itself was bending, like the horizon was warping under the weight of something terrible and ancient. My vision was a haze of shadow and light, flickering in and out of focus as the ground cracked further beneath my feet. The darkness, that entity, had emerged fully now, and it wasn't something that could be defined with the simple terms of creature or monster. It was presence, a raw, undiluted force that seemed to wrap itself around everything, seeping into the very air, twisting it with its malignant energy. I couldn't move, not because I didn't want to. I wanted to run, to escape this nightmare, but my body refused to respond. It was as though the weight of the silence had consumed not just my voice but my very ability to act. My heart pounded, each beat growing weaker, slower, under the oppressive weight of what was happening. My limbs were numb, and my chest felt like it was collapsing inward, unable to take a breath deep enough to fuel the desperate need for survival. The woman, that vessel of darkness, stood still beside me, her fingers still digging into my shoulder, anchoring me to the ground, anchoring me to the silence. Her hollow, black eyes never left mine as I struggled to understand the enormity of what was happening. But it was no use. The more I tried to make sense of it, the more elusive it became. Everything was blending together, the growls, the hissing, the oppressive quiet that had swallowed the world whole. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, that gnawing sensation that something worse than silence had begun. And then I heard it again, the voice. It was back, louder this time, more defined. The voice from the depths, from the cracks in the earth, from the very shadows that were swallowing everything whole. This time, I didn't hear the words. I felt them in my bones. They reverberated through the marrow, vibrating every nerve, shaking every thought. You think you can escape this. You think your silence is your salvation. It wasn't just a voice anymore. It was a presence, speaking directly to my mind, tearing away at any semblance of calm that was left in me. It wasn't just telling me the truth, it was forcing me to understand it. It's already too late. The words weren't spoken aloud. They were whispered straight into my mind, and they stung. They cut through my thoughts with a sharpness that felt like the edge of a blade against my very soul. I tried to block them out, to make sense of the chaos swirling around me, but it was impossible. The air itself felt thick, like it was suffocating me, choking off any rational thought that might have been left in me. The woman beside me began to move, though her body remained eerily still in its own way. It was as if her form was shifting between dimensions, her physicality fading in and out like a mirage, making it impossible to focus on her movements, on anything. She wasn't fully here, not in the way I understood here. She was a bridge, a channel between the silence and what came after. I had no idea what she wanted, or what it meant for the world now that the silence had been broken. I could only watch as she tilted her head to one side, as though considering something deeply. Her lips barely moved, but the words she spoke came through clearly, chillingly. It's time. And just like that, the world shifted once again. The air, heavy with tension and static, crackled, and suddenly, I felt the ground under my feet split open. Not a mere crack, a gaping maw, as though the earth itself had given birth to something so dark, so ancient, that it could no longer be contained. From the hole, an indescribable shadow poured out, swirling in on itself, folding in and out like smoke, like liquid night. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. The silence had claimed my voice, and with it, my ability to resist. There was no more hope, no more fight. I could only watch in terror as the very landscape around us seemed to distort and unravel. The shadows spread, crawling over the ground, suffocating the very light of the world. It was as though the sun itself had been extinguished, leaving only an eternal twilight, a dead and hollow world. The woman stepped forward, her movements impossibly slow, like time itself had been stretched thin, suspended in an eternal moment. Her face remained unreadable, but I could sense her connection to the creature that had emerged, to the darkness that seemed to consume everything it touched. I could feel it too, the cold, the presence, the pull of it, beckoning me, pulling me deeper into the silence. My feet moved without me, as if I were no longer in control of my body, as though the very earth itself was commanding me to come closer to the darkness, to accept its promise. "Join us," the voice said, and it wasn't the woman anymore. It was something more powerful, more ancient. The words echoed, each one a part of something far greater than my understanding. I couldn't stop moving. My legs carried me forward, each step a further descent into that abyss. My mind screamed for me to stop, to resist, to find a way out, but it was too late. The darkness, the silence, it was all consuming. There was no fighting it. There was only submission, only surrender to the inevitable. "You'll never escape. There is no escape from this." The voice wasn't just inside my head anymore. It was all around me, coming from the very air, the ground, the shadows. It was inside me, drowning out every thought, every desperate plea for salvation. There was nothing left to hold on to, no anchor, no refuge. Just the darkness, just the silence. And then, I was standing at the edge of the chasm, the void, and I could feel it pulling me in. It wasn't physical. It wasn't a matter of falling. It was more like being drawn into it, like a magnet, a force so strong it overpowered every ounce of resistance left in me. The darkness whispered in my ear. His words were clear now. "You will be one of us." And with that, I stepped forward, into nothingness. The moment I stepped into the void, time ceased to exist. There was no sensation of falling, no tug of gravity, no wind rushing past my ears. There was only a disorienting stillness, an overwhelming presence that consumed everything I had ever known, everything I had ever been. My senses were stripped away, leaving only the feeling of emptiness, a sensation so profound that I no longer felt like I was standing or lying or moving. I was nothing. I was no one. The silence, which had once been an oppressive weight, now felt like a living thing, wrapping itself around my very soul, caressing it, suffocating it. It was as if I had entered the heart of the void itself, a place where reality could not exist, a place where existence itself was just a cruel illusion. And then, from the depths of that silence, the voice returned. Not the woman's voice anymore, not the voice of that vessel, but something far more distant, far more ancient. It resonated in my mind, a low, echoing hum that seemed to shake the fabric of my being. Its tone was calm, almost soothing, like the lullaby of a predator before the kill. "Welcome." The word wasn't spoken aloud. It was felt, resonating deep inside of me. A cold, creeping sensation that crawled under my skin, wrapping itself around my thoughts. I couldn't remember who I was anymore. My identity had dissolved into the void, into the silence. But the voice remembered. The voice knew who I was, or who I had been before the silence had claimed me. "You are mine now." I wanted to scream, to fight against it, to retain whatever shred of humanity I had left. But there was nothing to hold on to. There was nothing left of myself. I was just a thought, a whisper in the dark, fading away with every breath I didn't take. The silence seemed to stretch on forever, an eternal lull, and in that stillness, something began to form. At first, it was just a flicker, a shadow at the edge of my perception. But then it grew, expanding like ink spilled into water, slowly, methodically. The void began to take shape, though not in any way I could comprehend. It was like staring at the edge of an infinite chasm, where no matter how hard I tried to focus, I couldn't make sense of it. It wasn't solid, wasn't tangible. It was conceptual, a thing that could not be described by words, only by the deep, unsettling sense that it was. And then the echo came. It started as a whisper, distant at first, but it grew louder, sharper, like 1,000 voices calling out from all directions. They weren't words. They were a feeling, a vibration of emotion and thought that could not be placed into the confines of language. But still, it had meaning. It had purpose. I could feel it as if it were speaking directly to the core of my being. You were never meant to speak. The words came like an exhaled breath, passing through the void and into my mind. They weren't meant for me. They weren't even meant for anyone. They were the echo of an ancient truth, a truth that existed before speech, before thought, before anything had ever been created. The silence is the true language. The silence is the truth you could not face. And then I understood. The silence wasn't a void. It wasn't just the absence of sound, the absence of presence. It was the essence of everything that had ever existed. It was the true state of being. The world I had known, the world we all know, was just a fleeting illusion, a temporary disturbance in the silence that stretched out into eternity. The darkness around me began to pulse, and with it, a deep, resonant hum filled the air, or at least I thought it did. The hum wasn't sound. It was vibration, a frequency that ran through everything. It was a constant, steady pulse, like the beating heart of the void itself. I couldn't see it, couldn't touch it, but I could feel it. It surrounded me, infiltrating me, slipping through my every pore, my every thought, until I was lost in it, becoming part of it. The echoing voices grew louder, their soundless words now indistinguishable from my own thoughts. They no longer felt like separate entities. They felt like part of me, like they had always been there, waiting for the moment when the silence would be broken. And then, like the sound of a door creaking open in the middle of the night, the truth was laid bare. You were always meant to be silenced. You were always meant to forget. It wasn't a revelation I welcomed. It wasn't something I could ever have prepared myself for. But it was the final piece of the puzzle, the missing link that explained everything. The silence, the void, the darkness. It had all been a preparation, a safeguard. We were never meant to speak. Our words were never meant to escape our lips, because the truth was that our voices were a threat, a disruption in the natural order. Our words had the potential to destroy the silence, to break the fragile thread that held the world together. We had always been a mistake, a ripple in an otherwise perfect existence. We were never meant to speak. I could feel it now, the oppressive weight of it, pressing down on my chest, crushing my lungs, filling my mind with a terrible clarity. This wasn't just about me. It wasn't about the woman, or the void, or the silence. It was about everyone. Every single person who had ever existed had been an intrusion, a flaw in the grand design of things. And now there was no going back. I felt myself fading again, my thoughts slipping further into the void, becoming less and less human. The echo of silence called to me, pulling me deeper, deeper into the absence, until there was nothing left but that one final whisper. You will never speak again. The last thing I felt before everything faded away was the silence itself, surrounding me, inside me, as it had always been. It was no longer a void. It was home.